When accusations of murder collide with the deadly Montana blizzard, sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Isabella Morgan faces the fight of her life, not just against the brutal winter that threatens to claim her and her unborn child, but against a family determined to see her hang for a crime she didn't commit. But when rancher Nathan Sullivan hears her desperate cries in the storm, neither of them realizes that this moment will change everything. Stay with me until the very end of Isabella and Nathan's incredible journey. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments what state you're watching from so I can see how far this story of survival and unexpected love reaches across our beautiful country. You killed my son. When blizzard accusations led to unexpected love in 1887 Montana, the accusation came with the wind carried on bitter February air that cut through wool and skin alike. Murderer. The word sliced through the growing dusk sharper than any Montana blade delivered by Victor Morgan with the cold precision of a man who'd been waiting months to speak it. He stood silhouetted in the doorway of the Morgan ranch house, his massive frame blocking what little warmth escaped from inside his breath, forming white clouds in the frigid air. Isabella Morgan stood 3 feet away, her swollen belly tight beneath her worn wool dress, and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. 8 months. 8 months she had lived in this house as Marcus's wife. 8 months of trying to belong to a family that had never wanted her. 8 months of walking on ice so thin she could hear it cracking beneath her feet. Now the ice had finally broken, and she was drowning. "Victor, please," she whispered, one hand instinctively moving to cradle her belly, where Marcus's child, their child, kicked restlessly, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them both. "Let me explain." "Explain." Victor's voice was a rumble of barely contained rage. Behind him she could see his younger brother Edmund leaner, but no less hostile, his pale eyes reflecting the lamplight like a wolf's. "You want to explain how my brother went from perfect health to a cold grave in 3 days. You want to explain the herbs we found hidden in your room, the same herbs that reek of death and witchcraft." The February wind howled across the open prairie, driving snow against the windows like thrown pebbles. Isabella could feel the cold seeping through her thin shawl through the walls themselves, as if winter was eager to claim her before Victor Morgan even finished his accusations. "Those herbs were to help him," she said, her voice growing stronger despite the fear clawing at her chest. Marcus had been having episodes pain in his chest, difficulty breathing. "I was trying to ease his suffering with remedies I learned from Sweetgrass Woman." Edmund stepped forward, his lip curled in disgust. "Sweetgrass Woman, your savage mother who filled your head with heathen nonsense." The words hit Isabella like physical blows. Sweetgrass Woman had been more mother to her than her own flesh and blood, taking in a 7-year-old orphan and raising her with infinite patience and love. The knowledge the Crow Woman had shared of healing herbs and natural medicines had saved lives on the reservation. But here in this house of Christian propriety and white man's medicine, it had become evidence of witchcraft. "She taught me to heal, not to harm," Isabella said, but her voice was losing strength against the tide of their hatred. "Heal." Victor laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Marcus is dead, woman. Dead and cold in the ground, and you want to call that healing?" Isabella felt tears begin to freeze on her cheeks. She thought of Marcus in those final days, pale and gasping, his hand pressed to his chest as pain racked his body. She thought of the herbs she'd gathered, the careful preparations she'd made following Sweetgrass Woman's instructions exactly. She thought of how she'd knelt beside Marcus's bed, whispering prayers in English, in Crow, begging whatever gods were listening to spare this man who had shown her kindness when the rest of the world had turned away. "I loved him," she whispered, and the truth of those words surprised her. Not the desperate, consuming love of poetry, but something quieter and more real gratitude that had deepened into genuine affection, companionship that had bloomed into care. "I would never hurt Marcus. He was my husband." "Your husband?" Edmund's voice dripped venom. "You think speaking words over a Bible makes you his wife? You think bearing his bastard gives you rights in this family?" Isabella's hand tightened on her belly. "Daniel is not a bastard. He is Marcus's son, conceived in marriage, blessed by God." "Daniel," Victor's eyes narrowed to slits. "You've already named the whelp, already planning how to use him to steal what's rightfully ours." The baby kicked hard against Isabella's ribs, as if protesting the harsh words. She took a step backward, her shoulder bumping against the door frame, and realized with growing horror that she was being pushed outside, not invited to leave, forced out into the killing cold of a Montana blizzard. "Victor," she said, trying to keep her voice calm despite the panic rising in her throat. "The baby is coming soon. Any day now. Surely you can wait until—" "We've waited long enough," Victor interrupted. He turned to Edmund, nodding toward the stairs. "Get her things." Edmund disappeared into the house, returning moments later with a canvas bag that contained everything Isabella owned in the world. Her few dresses, her precious collection of medicinal herbs, the silver locket that had belonged to her birth mother, the only link to a family she couldn't remember. It seemed impossible that 8 months of marriage, of trying to build a life with Marcus, could be reduced to such a pitiful collection of belongings. "There," Edmund said, dropping the bag at her feet with deliberate carelessness. "Everything that doesn't belong to this family." Isabella stared at the pie, then at the two men who had just sentenced her to death. Because that's what this was, murder by proxy. No woman survived alone in a Montana blizzard. No pregnant woman in the final weeks of pregnancy lasted an hour in sub-zero temperatures and driving snow. "You're killing me," she said quietly, the words hanging in the air like an accusation. Victor's expression didn't change. "We're removing a problem from our house. What happens after you leave is God's will." "And the baby?" Isabella's voice cracked despite her efforts to stay strong. "What about Marcus's child?" "There is no child," Edmund said coldly. "Marcus died childless. Whatever bastard you're carrying has no claim on Morgan blood or Morgan property." The words hit Isabella with the force of revelation. They weren't just throwing her out. They were erasing her, completely denying that she had ever been part of this family, that Marcus had ever loved her, that the child growing inside her had any right to exist. "The marriage certificate burned," Victor said flatly, "along with any other evidence of your association with our brother." Isabella felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. 8 months of marriage reduced to an association. Marcus's love dismissed as temporary madness. Their child declared a bastard before he even drew breath. She bent slowly, painfully, to pick up the canvas bag. Her back ached with the weight of the baby, and standing upright again left her breathless. Another contraction rippled across her belly, stronger than the ones she'd been feeling all day, more insistent. Her body was preparing for birth, whether she was ready or not. "I was his wife," she said, straightening with whatever dignity she could muster. "He loved me, and I loved him. And this baby," she placed both hands on her belly, protective and defiant, "this baby is innocent of whatever sins you think I've committed. The baby will be raised by his rightful family," Victor said. "After you're gone." The words hit her like ice water. They didn't just want her dead. They wanted her child. They planned to let her die in the wilderness and then claim Daniel as a Morgan orphan to be raised with their poisonous version of his father's memory. "No." The word came out stronger than Isabella had intended. "No, you will never touch my son." She turned toward the door, each step feeling like a small victory over the pain building in her body. At the threshold, she paused, looking back at the warm interior of what had briefly been her home. Golden lamplight spilled across familiar furniture, and she could smell Mabel's cooking drifting from the kitchen. For 8 months, this had been sanctuary. Now it was a tomb for dreams she'd dared to nurture. "When my son grows up and asks about his mother," Isabella said, her voice carrying across the wind, "you tell him this. Tell him Isabella Morgan loved his father with everything she had. Tell him she died protecting him from the men who would have stolen his father's love and poisoned his mother's memory." Then she stepped out into the storm. "I never," she began, but Edmund Morgan, Victor's younger brother, stepped forward with eyes that held no mercy. "Marcus is dead because of you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Your witchcraft, your poisons. We found the herbs in your room, Isabella. We know what you did." The February wind howled across the Morgan ranch, driving snow against the windows like thrown stones. Isabella's hands moved instinctively to her belly, where Marcus's child, their child, moved restlessly, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them both. "Those herbs were to help him," she whispered, but her voice was lost in the storm. "Marcus had pain in his chest. I was trying to kill him." Victor finished, his face hard as winter granite. "And you succeeded. 6 months since pneumonia had claimed Marcus Morgan, in 3 brutal days, leaving Isabella alone with his family's suspicion and a pregnancy that had become more burden than blessing. She thought the worst was behind her, thought that giving birth to a Morgan heir would finally secure her place in this family. She'd been wrong. Thunder rumbled overhead, though February. Thunder was wrong, ominous. The storm building outside mirrored the storm in Victor Morgan's eyes as he stepped closer, his bulk filling the doorway. "You have 1 hour," he said. "Take what's yours and get off Morgan land." "What's mine?" Isabella's voice cracked. "This baby is yours. This baby is Marcus's son. No heir of ours will be raised by his father's killer." The words hit her like physical blows. Isabella staggered backward, her hand gripping the doorframe for support. "I loved Marcus. I would never." "Love," Edmund Morgan laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You trapped him, a young man with a weak constitution and a kind heart, and you trapped him with your foreign ways and your widow's tricks." Foreign ways. The accusation stung because it carried truth. Isabella had learned her herb lore from her adopted Crow mother, Sweetgrass Woman, who had taken in a 7-year-old orphan and raised her as one of the people. The knowledge had saved lives on the reservation, but here in this white man's house, it had become evidence of witchcraft. "I am his wife," she said, but her voice was losing strength. "Legally wed before God and witness." "Were," Victor corrected. "You were his wife. Now you're nothing but the woman who killed him." The baby kicked hard as if protesting the harsh words. Isabella doubled over slightly, pain radiating through her lower back. "Not now," she thought desperately. "Not now when I need all my strength." But her body had its own timeline, and the stress of the confrontation was taking its toll. She could feel the familiar tightening in her belly, the warning signs that had been building all day. "Please," she whispered, looking from Victor to Edmund, seeking some hint of compassion in faces that had been carved from the same unforgiving stone as their father. "The baby is coming soon. A few more days, maybe a week." "Let me stay until—" "You stay until you're in the ground," Victor said flatly, "which is where you belong." Edmund moved to the stairs, returning moments later with a canvas bag that contained everything Isabella owned in the world. Her few dresses, her precious collection of medicinal herbs, the silver locket that had belonged to her birth mother, the only link to a family she couldn't remember. "There," he said, dropping the bag at her feet. "That's everything that doesn't belong to this family." Isabella stared at the bag, then at the 2 men who had just sentenced her to death. Because that's what this was, she realized with crystal clarity. No woman survived alone in a Montana blizzard. No pregnant woman giving birth in the wilderness lived to see morning. This was murder by proxy. The realization came with a strange calm. If they meant to kill her, she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her beg. Isabella straightened, drawing on reserves of strength she'd learned during her years with Sweetgrass Woman. The people had taught her that dignity was the one thing no one could take away unless you let them. "Marcus loved me," she said quietly, and for the first time since this nightmare began, her voice was steady. "He married me because he loved me, not because I trapped him. And this baby—" She touched her belly protectively. "This baby is innocent of whatever you think I've done." "The baby will be raised by its rightful family," Victor said, "after you're gone." The words hit her like ice water. They didn't just want her dead. They wanted her child. "No." The word came out stronger than she'd intended. "No, you will never touch my baby." She bent to pick up her bag, pain shooting through her back as she straightened. Another contraction, stronger this time, rippled through her belly. Her body was preparing for birth, whether she was ready or not. "You can throw me out," she said, meeting Victor's cold stare with one of her own. "You can steal my husband's property and deny my marriage and call me murderer. But you will never, ever touch my child." She walked toward the door, each step a small victory over the pain building in her body. At the threshold, she turned back once. "When this baby grows up and asks about his mother, you tell him this," she said. "Tell him Isabella Morgan loved his father with everything she had. Tell him she died protecting him from the men who would have stolen his father's love and his mother's memory." Then she stepped out into the storm. The wind hit her like a living thing, driving snow into her face and stealing her breath. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since morning, and the sky had the bruised look of a storm that meant business. This wasn't just weather. This was nature showing its teeth. Isabella pulled her thin shawl closer around her shoulders, inadequate protection against what was coming, and started walking toward the road. She had no destination, no plan beyond putting distance between herself and the men who wanted her dead. The bag felt impossibly heavy in her hand, her belly impossibly large. With each step, the wind grew stronger, the snow thicker. By the time she reached the end of the Morgan Drive, the world had disappeared into a white void. She was alone. 30 miles from the nearest town, with night falling in a blizzard building to deadly proportions, Isabella, Morgan widow accused murderer, mother-to-be, faced the wilderness that would either save her or claim her. The baby moved restlessly inside her as if sensing the danger. Isabella placed both hands on her belly, feeling the tight drum of skin that held her child. "We'll find a way," she whispered to the life inside her arm. "Somehow we'll find a way." But even as she spoke the words, another contraction gripped her stronger than the ones before. Her body was preparing for birth, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Isabella Morgan stepped forward into the storm, each footstep a prayer, each breath a small act of defiance against the men who had condemned her to die. Behind her, warm light spilled from the windows of the house that had briefly been her home. Ahead lay only darkness, cold, and the vast indifference of a Montana winter. She walked toward it anyway. 25 miles away, Nathan Sullivan felt the storm coming in his bones. At 35, Nathan had spent enough winters in Montana territory to recognize the signs that escape most men. The particular quality of silence that settled over the land just before nature showed her teeth. The way his cattle bunched together in the lower pastures, their instincts more reliable than any barometer. The sharp metallic taste in the air that spoke of snow, measured not in inches but in feet. He'd been working since before dawn, moving his herd to sheltered ground and reinforcing the barn against winds that would try to tear the roof clean off. His ranch, the Circle S, sprawled across 5,000 acres of some of the most beautiful and unforgiving land God had ever created. Rolling hills covered in buffalo grass, mountain meadows that turned purple with wildflowers in spring, and winters that could kill a man in 20 minutes if he wasn't careful. Nathan was always careful. 20 years of working this land had taught him that survival wasn't about courage or strength. It was about respect. Respect for the weather, respect for the animals in your care, respect for the vast indifference of a landscape that could provide everything you needed or take everything you had without a moment's hesitation. But today, respect hadn't been enough to get him home before the storm hit. He'd been checking fence lines on the North Ridge when he'd found the break, 30 feet of posts knocked down by winter winds and elk moving through the high country. It was the kind of damage that could lose him half his herd if he didn't fix it before the storm arrived. The cattle would follow the breaks seeking shelter in the canyon beyond, and once they scattered in that rocky maze, he'd be finding frozen carcasses until spring. So he'd stayed working with numbing fingers while the wind picked up and the first flakes began to fall. He'd reset posts and stretch wire, cursing his own stubbornness, even as he drove the Staples home with steady practice blows. Mabel Crawford, his housekeeper, and the closest thing to family he had left, would give him an earful when he finally made it back to the ranch house. She'd been warning him for years that his tendency to put the work ahead of his own safety would get him killed one day. Looking at the wall of white bearing down from the northwest, Nathan was beginning to think she might be right. His horse dancer was a 16-year-old buckskin gelding with the heart of a Mustang and the endurance of a mountain goat. They'd been partners for over a decade, and Nathan trusted the animal's judgment as much as his own. Right now, Dancer was telling him in horse language that they needed to find shelter, and soon. The nearest shelter was his own ranch, still 8 miles away, across increasingly treacherous ground. The old trapper's cabin sat about 2 miles north, tucked into a grove of pine trees at the base of Rocky Butte. It wasn't much: 4 log walls, a stone fireplace, and a roof that only leaked in 3 places, but it had saved Nathan's life twice over the years, when weather had caught him away from home. Nathan pulled his hat down low and turned Dancer's head toward the cabin, leaning forward in the saddle to cut through wind that was already strong enough to push a man off his feet. The temperature was dropping fast. He could feel it through his wool coat and leather chaps. By full dark, this would be the kind of storm that froze exposed flesh in minutes and turned familiar landmarks into death traps. They made good time across the open ground, dancers' hooves finding purchase on frozen earth despite the snow that was beginning to accumulate. But as they entered the timber, the wind picked up to a howl that drowned out everything else. Snow drove sideways through the trees, thick enough to turn the world into a white void, where direction became meaningless and disaster waited behind every drift. That's when Nathan heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind, just another voice in the storm's chorus of shrieks and howls. But then he heard it again, and every instinct he'd developed over 2 decades of mountain living went on high alert. A human voice. Female. Desperate. Nathan pulled Dancer to a stop, straining to listen over the wind. The sound came again, fainter now, already being swallowed by distance and weather, but unmistakably human. Unmistakably in trouble. Every rational part of Nathan's mind told him to keep riding, told him that stopping to investigate meant risking his own life in weather that was rapidly becoming deadly, told him that no one could be alive out here, that he was probably hearing elk or coyotes or just the wind playing tricks on his imagination. But 6 months ago, Nathan's sister Anna had died in childbirth in a warm, safe house with a doctor present and everything that modern medicine could provide. She'd still died, and Nathan had been helpless to save her. The guilt of that failure aided him daily, the feeling that he should have done something, should have been able to protect the last member of his family. He wasn't going to let someone else die if he could prevent it. Nathan turned Dancer toward the sound, urging the gelding off what he hoped was still the trail and into deeper snow. The horse balked, ears pinned back against the wind, but Nathan pressed gently with his heels, and the animal obeyed, plunging forward through drifts that were already belly deep and getting deeper by the minute. The voice came again, closer now, but weaker. Human speech, though he couldn't make out words. Nathan guided Dancer toward the sound, following what might have been a road under all that snow. The wind was brutal here, unbroken by trees, driving ice crystals into his face until his cheeks went numb and his eyes streamed water. Then he saw her. He'd been working since dawn to move his cattle to lower pastures, racing against weather that promised to be brutal, even by Montana standards. The wind had been picking up steadily all day, and the sky had that particular shade of gray-white that meant serious snow was on the way. He should have been home by now, should have been sitting by his fire with a cup of coffee and a book, letting the storm rage outside while he stayed warm and safe. But there had been fence damage on the North Ridge posts, knocked down by winter winds, and if he didn't fix it before the storm hit full force, he'd lose livestock he couldn't afford to replace. So he'd stayed working with numbing fingers while the wind bit through his coat and the first snowflakes began to fall. Now, with darkness coming and the storm building to a howl, Nathan was paying the price for his stubbornness. His horse Dancer was struggling through snow that was already knee-deep and getting deeper by the minute. The gelding was a good animal, strong, sure-footed, bred for mountain work, but even he couldn't fight this weather much longer. Nathan pulled his coat tighter and leaned forward in the saddle, trying to cut through wind that felt like knives. Home was still 10 miles away, and with visibility dropping to zero, those 10 miles might as well have been 100. He was thinking about shelter, about the old trapper's cabin that sat in a grove of pine trees about a mile north when he heard the sound. At first, he thought it was the wind, just another voice in the storm's chorus of howls and shrieks. But then he heard it again, and the hair on the back of his neck stood up. A human voice. Female. Desperate. Nathan pulled Dancer to a stop, straining to listen over the wind. There again, faint and broken, but unmistakably human. Someone was out there. Someone was in trouble. Every rational part of Nathan's mind told him to keep riding, told him that stopping to investigate meant risking his own life, that no one could be alive in this storm, that he was probably hearing things anyway. But the sound came again, and this time he could make out the word, "Help!" Nathan turned Dancer toward the sound, pushing the horse off the barely visible trail and into deeper snow. The gelding balked, ears pinned back against the wind, but Nathan urged him forward with gentle pressure from his heels. 6 months ago, Nathan's sister Anna had died in childbirth in a warm, safe house with a doctor present and everything that modern medicine could provide. She'd still died, leaving Nathan with a guilt that aided him daily, the feeling that he should have done something, should have been able to save her somehow. He wasn't going to let someone else die if he could help it. The voice came again, closer now, but weaker. Nathan guided Dancer toward the sound, following what might have been a road under all that snow. The wind was brutal here, unbroken by trees, driving ice crystals into his face until his cheeks were numb and his eyes watered. Then he saw her, a dark shape against the white crumpled at the base of a cottonwood tree. At first he thought she was dead. No one could survive long in this cold. But as he rode closer, he saw movement. Slight but movement nonetheless. Nathan was off his horse before Dancer fully stopped, his boots sinking into snow that came up to his knees. The woman was small, dark-haired, wearing nothing but a thin dress and a shawl that provided less protection than paper. Her lips were blue, her skin waxy with cold, and her belly, God above her belly, was huge with pregnancy. She was in labor. Even through the snow and wind, Nathan could see the way her body tensed, could hear the broken sound she made as a contraction gripped her. This wasn't just exposure they were dealing with. This baby was coming, whether they were ready or not. Nathan knelt beside her, pulling off his heavy coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. Her eyes open, brown eyes dark with pain and fear, and focused on him with desperate intensity. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Please, my baby." Another contraction hit her, and she screamed, the same sound Nathan had been hearing carried on the wind. The sound of a woman fighting for her life and her child's life with everything she had. "I've got you," Nathan said, scooping her up in his arms. She was light, too light for a woman so far along, and she curled into his chest like a child seeking warmth. The trapper's cabin was close, maybe a quarter-mile through the trees. If they could make it there, if he could get a fire started, maybe they had a chance. Nathan lifted the woman onto his saddle, keeping one arm around her to steady her while he grabbed Dancer's reins with the other. The horse didn't like the extra weight, didn't like the sounds of distress, but Nathan spoke low and firm, and the animal responded. They fought their way through the trees, snow pelting them from every direction, wind trying to knock them over with each step. The woman, Isabella, she'd gasped when he'd asked her name, was conscious but barely responsive. Her body racked with contractions that seemed to be coming faster and harder. When the cabin finally appeared through the swirling snow, Nathan felt a relief so profound it was almost physical. The structure was rough, built by trappers decades ago, and maintained by ranchers who used it for emergency shelter, but it had 4 walls, a roof, and a stone fireplace. Right now, it looked like paradise. Nathan kicked the door open, it was never locked, and carried Isabella inside. The cabin was dark and cold wind whistling through gaps in the logs, but it was shelter, it was a chance. He laid Isabella down on the packed dirt floor near the fireplace, then went to work building a fire with the desperate efficiency of a man who knew that minutes mattered. His hands shook as he arranged kindling, struck flint to steel, coaxed flames from tinder that seemed too damp to catch. But catch it did, and soon firelight was dancing across the cabin walls, throwing warmth into corners that had been cold for months. Nathan turned back to Isabella and found her watching him with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and terror. "The baby," she whispered, "the baby's coming." Nathan had delivered calves and foals, had seen birth dozens of times in the animal world. But this was different. This was a human life, 2 human lives hanging in the balance. "What's your name?" he asked, kneeling beside her and checking her pulse. It was rapid but strong. "Isabella Morgan," she gasped. "My husband Marcus, he died 6 months ago. His family, they said I killed him. They threw me out." Nathan felt ice form in his chest that had nothing to do with the storm. "They threw you out in this weather while you're in labor." Isabella nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "They want the baby. They think if I die, they can raise him as a Morgan heir." Jesus Christ. Nathan had known cruel men, but this was beyond cruelty. This was murder. Another contraction gripped Isabella, and she screamed again, her back arching off the ground. Nathan could see the baby's head beginning to crown. "Okay," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Okay, Isabella, we're gonna do this, you and me and your baby, but I need you to listen to me and do exactly what I say." Isabella nodded, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "First, you're not going to date," Nathan said firmly. "Neither is your baby. I'm not going to let that happen. You understand me?" "Yes." Her voice was weak but determined. "Second, when I tell you to push, you push with everything you will get. This baby wants to meet his mama, and we're going to make sure that happens." Over the next hour, Nathan Sullivan, rancher bachelor man, who had never delivered a human baby in his life, helped bring Isabella Morgan's son into the world. He guided her through contractions that seemed to go on forever, caught the baby when he finally slipped free, cut the cord with his knife, after holding it in the flames to sterilize it. When the baby cried a thin, wavering sound that was the most beautiful thing Nathan had ever heard, Isabella sobbed with relief. "He's perfect," Nathan said, wrapping the baby in his spare shirt and placing him in Isabella's arms. "He's absolutely perfect." Isabella looked down at her son with wonder, touching his tiny fingers, his dark hair, his perfect little face. "Daniel," she whispered. "His name is Daniel." Nathan built up the fire and made sure mother and baby were warm, melting snow for water, and doing everything he could think of to keep them comfortable. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, 3 lives had been forever changed. "Why did you stop?" Isabella asked quietly when Daniel had fallen asleep against her chest. "You could have kept writing. Most men would have." Nathan was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "My sister Anna died in childbirth 6 months ago," he finally said. "I couldn't save her, but I could save you." Isabella studied his face in the firelight, strong features weathered by years of outdoor work eyes that held both kindness and grief. "I'm sorry," she said, "about your sister." "She would have liked you," Nathan replied. "Anna always said the measure of a person wasn't how they acted when life was easy, but how they fought when everything went wrong." "And what does that make me?" Nathan looked at her, this woman who had walked into a blizzard rather than surrender her child who had given birth in a freezing cabin and still found strength to spew at her baby. "A fighter," he said simply, "the strongest person I've ever met." As the storm continued to howl outside, Isabella, Morgan, and Nathan Sullivan sat by the fire with a newborn baby between them both, knowing that something had shifted in the space of a few hours. Not love, not yet, but the recognition of something that might become love, given time and trust. The first foundation stone of a life they would build together. The storm broke 3 days later, leaving the Montana landscape transformed into something unrecognizable. Snow had buried familiar landmarks under drifts 10 feet deep, turning the world into a blank canvas of white that stretched to the horizon. Nathan stood in the doorway of the cabin, studying the changed landscape while Isabella nursed Daniel by the fire. The baby was thriving, despite his dramatic entrance into the world. Strong lungs, good appetite, alert eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. His mother was a different story. Isabella had lost too much blood during the birth, and the days of poor nutrition before that night had taken their toll. She was weak, pale, fighting to recover while caring for a newborn. Nathan had been hunting what small game he could find, melting snow for water, doing everything possible to help her regain her strength. But they couldn't stay in the cabin forever. His own ranch was still 15 miles away, and Mabel Crawford, his housekeeper, would be worried sick by now. She'd probably already sent riders out looking for him. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door and moving back to the fire. Isabella looked up from Daniel wariness creeping into her eyes. Over the past 3 days, she'd told Nathan more of her story about being orphaned young and raised by the Crow, about Marcus Morgan's unexpected proposal, and their brief, complicated marriage, about the accusations that had followed his death. "The Morgan brothers will be looking for you," Nathan continued. "Once the snow melts enough for travel, they'll come. And when they do, they'll try to take Daniel." Isabella's arms tightened protectively around her baby. "They'll never touch him." "Not if I can help it," Nathan agreed. "But we need to be smart about this. They're powerful men with money and connections. If they claim you kidnapped their nephew, if they tell people you killed Marcus—" "I didn't kill Marcus." Isabella's voice was sharp with old pain. "He had episodes where his heart would race and he couldn't catch his breath. I was trying to help him with herbs I learned from Sweetgrass Woman. But the morning he died, he collapsed before I could even give him anything." Nathan studied her face in the firelight. He'd gotten good at reading people over his 35 years, and everything about Isabella spoke of honesty. The way she looked directly at him when she spoke, the grief that still shadowed her eyes when she mentioned her husband, the fierce protectiveness when she held her son. "I believe you," he said quietly. "But belief isn't enough. We need something that will hold up in court." "What do you mean, huh?" Nathan had been thinking about this for days, turning possibilities over in his mind, like stones looking for something that would work. The solution he'd arrived at was unconventional, possibly crazy, but it might be the only way to protect Isabella and Daniel. "Marry me," he said. The words hung in the air between them. Isabella stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "I'm sorry, what? Marry me," Nathan repeated. Legally, properly with witnesses and paperwork. If you're my wife, the Morgans can't claim Daniel. He'd be my son under law. Isabella shook her head slowly. Nathan, you can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Nathan leaned forward, his expression intense. Think about it. You have no legal standing as a widow if they're claiming your marriage to Marcus was invalid. But as my wife, you'd have protection, rights they couldn't challenge. You would sacrifice your freedom, your chance at a real marriage for someone you've known 3 days? Nathan was quiet for a moment, searching for the right words. The truth was complicated, a mixture of duty and genuine caring of guilt over Anna's death and admiration for Isabella's strength. 6 months ago, I watched my sister die, and I couldn't do anything to save her, he said finally. Maybe this is my chance to save someone else, someone who deserves saving. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. That's not a reason to get married. It's not a bad reason, Nathan countered. People have married for worse, for money, for social standing, for convenience. At least this would be for protection, for justice. And what about love? The question hit Nathan unexpectedly hard. He'd been married once briefly to a woman who died of consumption 2 years into their marriage. Since then, he'd convinced himself he was better off alone, that the ranch was enough, that he didn't need the complications that came with a wife and family. But watching Isabella with Daniel over the past 3 days, seeing the fierce tenderness with which she cared for her son, had awakened something in Nathan he'd thought was buried with his first wife. Love isn't always lightning strikes and poetry, he said carefully. Sometimes it grows from respect and shared purpose. Sometimes it's a choice you make and then live into. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, her hand gentle on Daniel's dark hair. And if I say yes, what would you expect from me? Nothing you don't want to give, Nathan said immediately. This would be about protection, not other things. We'd figure out how to live together as we went along. You're talking about giving up your whole life for people you barely know. I'm talking about doing what's right. Nathan's voice carried quiet conviction. Those men threw you out to die because you were inconvenient. They wanted you dead so they could steal your son and raise him with their poisonous version of his father's memory. I won't let that happen. Daniel stirred in Isabella's arms, making the small sounds that meant he was waking up. She looked down at him with such love that Nathan's chest ached. What about your ranch, your housekeeper? How would you explain a sudden wife and baby? Mabel's been nagging me to get married for years, Nathan said with a slight smile. She'll be thrilled. As for the ranch, it's doing well enough to support a family. More than well enough. The Morgans will challenge this. They'll claim it's fraud. Let them try. We'll have a legal marriage certificate and witnesses. We'll file adoption papers for Daniel. They can claim whatever they want, but the law will be on our side. Isabella was quiet for so long that Nathan began to think she would refuse. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. If I say yes, if we do this, I need you to understand something. She looked up at him with eyes that held both strength and vulnerability. I cared about Marcus. I mourned him. But what we had wasn't love, not really. It was gratitude dressed up as affection. He was kind to me when I had nowhere else to go, and I was grateful for that kindness. I'm not asking you to pretend feelings you don't have, Nathan said gently. And I won't lie to you or try to trap you into something deeper than you're offering. This would be honest between us, a partnership, not a romance. Nathan nodded. Honest is good. Honest is what we need. Isabella took a shaky breath. Then yes, I'll marry you. Not because I have any right to ask this of you, but because my son deserves a chance at a life that's more than running and hiding. She met his eyes with fierce determination. And I swear to you, Nathan Sullivan, I will never make you regret this choice. I'll work hard. I'll earn my place. I'll be a good wife in every way that matters. I know you will, Nathan said, and he meant it. They were married 2 weeks later in the ranch house parlor with Mabel Crawford as witness and the circuit preacher who happened to be traveling through the area. It was a simple ceremony. No flowers, no music, no celebration. Just words spoken over a Bible and signatures on paper that would hold up in any court. Isabella wore one of Mabel's dresses altered to fit her still slight frame. Daniel slept through the entire ceremony wrapped in a quilt Mabel had dug out of storage. Nathan stood stiff and formal in his best suit, feeling like he was watching someone else's life unfold. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Nathan kissed Isabella's cheek, a brief, respectful touch that sealed their bargain. Well, Mabel said when the preacher had gone and they stood awkwardly in the parlor, I suppose congratulations are in order, though this is the strangest courtship I've ever witnessed. Strange times call for practical solutions, Nathan replied. Mabel looked at Isabella with shrewd but not unkind eyes. You're mistress of this house now, child. That means you have a say in how things are run. Don't let this stubborn fool intimidate you into silence. Yes, ma'am, Isabella said softly. That night, Nathan moved his belongings into the smaller bedroom down the hall, giving Isabella and Daniel the master bedroom. She protested, said he shouldn't give up his own space, but he insisted. The room had been his parents' once, then his and his first wife's, then his alone after she died. It felt right somehow to have Isabella there with Daniel, like he was giving them something solid and permanent. Nathan lay awake for hours that first night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a baby in the house of Isabella's soft footsteps as she walked Daniel through a bout of restless crying. The ranch felt different with them, they're fuller, more alive. But the peace wouldn't last. Nathan knew the Morgans would come as soon as the roads were passable. When they did, he'd be ready for them. 3 weeks after the wedding, that readiness was put to the test. Nathan was in the barn checking on a mare who was due to foal when he heard the sound of horses in the yard. He walked out to find 2 men dismounting, one tall and heavy-set with a thick beard, the other lean and sharp-featured with cold eyes. Both wore expensive coats and rode good horses, and there was an air of entitlement about them that set Nathan's teeth on edge. "Help you gentlemen?" Nathan asked, keeping his voice neutral. The heavy-set man turned, looking Nathan up and down with barely concealed disdain. "We're looking for a woman, young, dark hair, heavily pregnant last time we saw her. Goes by the name Isabella Morgan, though she has no right to that name." Nathan felt ice form in his veins, but his expression didn't change. "What's your business with her?" "Family business," the sharp-featured man said. "I'm Victor Morgan. This is my brother Edmund. She stole property from our household and fled during a storm. We've come to collect what's ours." "Stole property, bro," Nathan repeated slowly. "That what you call a woman's belongings? We call it theft when someone takes what doesn't belong to them," Victor replied. "We have reason to believe she came this way during the blizzard. If you're harboring her, you're interfering with family matters." Nathan studied the 2 men, seeing the arrogance in their faces, the casual cruelty that had let them throw a pregnant woman into a deadly storm. "Funny thing," he said conversationally, "I haven't seen anyone matching that description." It was technically true. The Isabella he'd found in the snow had been pregnant. The woman in his house now was a new mother, legally his wife. Victor's eyes narrowed. "You're lying." "You calling me a liar on my own property?" Nathan's voice dropped to something quiet and dangerous. "I'm saying you'd be wise to cooperate." Victor stepped closer. "We're prepared to search your property if necessary." "With what authority?" "The authority of men seeking justice for theft and possibly murder." Nathan's hand moved casually to rest on the butt of the revolver at his hip. "And I'm a man protecting his family on his own land. You want to search my property, you come back with a warrant and a sheriff. Until then, I suggest you leave." "This isn't over," Edmund said as they mounted their horses. "We'll be back with proper authority." "I'll be here," Nathan replied. After they rode away, Nathan found Isabella standing at the kitchen window, Daniel in her arms, her face pale with fear. "They found us," she whispered. "They found us," Nathan confirmed. "But we're ready for them. We're married now, legally and properly. Daniel is legally my son. They can bluster and threaten all they want, but the law is on our side." "Is it enough?" Nathan put his hands on her shoulder, steadying her. "It has to be." But even as he said the words, Nathan knew the real battle was just beginning. The Morgans would be back with lawyers and warrants and all the weight that money and influence could buy. When they came, Nathan would be ready to fight for his family, because that's what Isabella and Daniel had become, whether he'd planned it or not. His family, his responsibility, his to protect, and God help anyone who tried to take them away. Sheriff Douglas Warren arrived on a Tuesday morning in April when the snow had finally melted enough to reveal the brown grass underneath, and the roads were passable again. Nathan watched from the porch as the lawman rode up with the Morgan brothers and a thin man in spectacles who looked like a lawyer. Nathan had been expecting this, had spent weeks preparing for it, filing papers in town, consulting with Catherine Pierce, a sharp attorney from Helena who specialized in family law and had a reputation for not backing down from powerful men. "Morning, Sheriff," Nathan said as the group dismounted. Warren tipped his hat, but his expression was uncomfortable. Nathan had known Doug Warren for 15 years, and the man was fundamentally decent, even if he sometimes bent to political pressure. "Morning, Nathan. I've got a warrant here to search the premises for stolen property and a woman wanted for questioning in connection with a suspicious death." Nathan took the paper Warren offered, scanning it quickly. It looked official enough, though he suspected Catherine would find holes in it. "You're welcome to search," Nathan said calmly, "but you won't find any stolen property because there isn't any. And the only woman here is my wife." Victor Morgan stepped forward aggressively. "Your wife, when did you get married?" "3 weeks ago," Nathan replied. "Legal ceremony, proper witnesses filed with the territorial clerk." "You want to see the certificate?" The thin man who had to be the Morgan's lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm James Blackwell, representing the Morgan family. We have evidence that this marriage is fraudulent, designed to protect a fugitive from justice." "Evidence?" Nathan raised an eyebrow. "What evidence would that be?" "The timing, for one thing. A sudden marriage to a woman no one in the territory had seen before, immediately after she disappeared from our client's property." Nathan was about to respond when the front door opened and Isabella appeared, Daniel in her arms. She wore a simple blue dress that Mabel had helped her alter, her hair pinned up in a style that made her look older, more settled. Most importantly, she wore the gold wedding band Nathan had placed on her finger during their ceremony. "Gentlemen," she said quietly, "I understand you're looking for me." Victor Morgan's face flushed red. "Isabella Hart, or should I say the woman who claims to be Isabella Hart." "I'm Isabella Sullivan now," she corrected calmly. "Legally married to Nathan Sullivan, as you can see." She held up her left hand, the ring catching the morning sunlight. "A marriage of convenience," Blackwell interjected, "clearly designed to evade justice." "Justice?" Isabella's voice sharpened. "What justice is there in throwing a pregnant woman into a blizzard? What justice is there in stealing a dead man's property from his widow?" "You were never Marcus's widow," Victor snarled. "That marriage was a sham, and you know it." "Actually," Nathan said, reaching into his coat pocket, "we have documentation that says otherwise." He handed Sheriff Warren a folder of papers. "Marriage certificate from the territorial clerk, signed and witnessed. Birth certificate for Daniel Sullivan, my legally adopted son. All filed properly and completely legal." Warren examined the documents, his expression growing more uncomfortable by the minute. Nathan could see the man realizing he'd been drawn into a situation that was far more complicated than the Morgans had led him to believe. "These look to be in order," Warren said finally. "They're forgeries," Edmund Morgan snapped. "Backdated documents designed to create a false legal standing." "Are you suggesting I forged official territorial documents?" Nathan's voice carried quiet menace. "That's a serious accusation, Edmund. One that could land you in federal prison." Catherine Pierce chose that moment to arrive, riding up on a bay mare with saddlebags that undoubtedly contained enough legal precedent to bury the Morgans in paperwork. "Gentlemen," she said, dismounting and straightening her riding skirt, "I'm Catherine Pierce, representing Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan. I understand there's some question about the validity of my client's marriage." Blackwell stepped forward. "There certainly is. This marriage is clearly fraudulent, designed to circumvent my client's legitimate claim to their nephew." "Their nephew?" Catherine's voice was crisp, professional. "On what basis do your clients claim relationship to Daniel Sullivan?" "Daniel Morgan," Victor corrected. "But of our deceased brother, Marcus." "Ah." Catherine opened one of her saddlebags and withdrew a thick folder. "Then perhaps you can explain these medical records from Dr. Henry Walsh in Helena, documenting Marcus Morgan's treatment for a congenital heart condition." The words hit the assembled group like a thunderbolt. Nathan saw Victor's face go white, saw Edmund take an involuntary step backward. "That's impossible," Victor stammered. "Marcus never told you." Catherine's smile was sharp as winter wind. "According to Dr. Walsh, Marcus consulted him multiple times about episodes of chest pain, irregular heartbeat, and shortness of breath. The doctor's opinion was that Marcus suffered from a weak heart, a condition he was born with, and that could prove fatal and without proper care." Isabella gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "The herbs," she whispered. "The foxglove and hawthorn I was trying to give him. Dr. Walsh recommended those for heart conditions in his medical journal. You knew about the heart condition, Nathan asked. I suspected, Isabella said, tears streaming down her face. Marcus would have episodes where he'd turn pale and have trouble breathing. Sweetgrass Woman taught me that foxglove could help with heart troubles, but it has to be prepared exactly right or it becomes poison. I was trying to help him, but he died before I could even prepare the medicine properly. Catherine nodded grimly. Which brings us to the matter of Mr. Marcus Morgan's death, Doctor. Walsh has reviewed the circumstances and believes, based on his medical knowledge of the deceased, that Marcus died of heart failure, a natural progression of his condition, not poisoning. This is preposterous, Blackwell sputtered. You can't prove... Actually, I can. Catherine withdrew another document. Dr. Walsh has agreed to testify that Isabella Sullivan's attempts to treat her husband with traditional remedies were not only appropriate, but showed considerable medical knowledge. Far from trying to poison Marcus, she was trying to save his life. The silence that followed was deafening. Nathan watched the Morgan brothers' faces cycle through disbelief, rage, and finally fear. Furthermore, Catherine continued relentlessly, we have witnesses who will testify that these gentlemen threw Mrs. Sullivan out of their house during a deadly blizzard while she was in active labor. In Montana territory, that constitutes attempted murder. Sheriff Warren straightened. Is that true? Of course not, Victor said, but his voice lacked conviction. She left of her own accord. After you physically removed her from the house, Nathan said coldly. After you refused her shelter during a storm that killed half the cattle in this county. We'll fight this in court, Blackwell said, but he was already backing toward his horse. We'll prove this marriage is fraudulent. Please do, Catherine replied pleasantly. I look forward to cross-examining your clients under oath about their treatment of a pregnant woman during a medical emergency. The Morgans and their lawyer left in a cloud of threats and bluster, but Nathan could see the defeat in their posture. They'd come expecting to collect a helpless woman and a baby they could claim. Instead, they'd found a united family with legal representation and evidence that turned their accusations back on them. After they rode away, Isabella sank onto the porch steps. Daniel clutched to her chest. Is it over? She asked quietly. Not yet, Catherine said, settling beside her son. They'll likely try to challenge the marriage in court, but we have enough evidence to defend it. More importantly, we now have proof that you weren't trying to poison your husband, you were trying to save him. Nathan sat down on Isabella's other side. The adoption papers for Daniel are solid. Even if they somehow prove the marriage was fraudulent, which they can't, Daniel is legally my son now. They can't touch him. Isabella looked at Nathan with eyes bright with tears. Why are you doing this? Really, you could have just given me shelter until I was strong enough to move on. You didn't have to marry me, you adopt Daniel, fight my battles. Nathan was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer. Over the weeks since their wedding, he'd watched Isabella integrate into ranch life with quiet competence. She'd taken over much of the cooking from Mabel, learned to manage the household accounts, proven herself capable and intelligent in dozens of small ways. But more than that, he'd watched her with Daniel. The fierce tenderness, the patient attention, the way she sang to him in the evenings, in a voice that was surprisingly lovely. He'd watched her learn to trust again, seen her smile return gradually as she realized she was truly safe. And somewhere in those weeks of watching and learning and quiet partnership, Nathan had made a discovery that both thrilled and terrified him. He was falling in love with his wife. Because it's right, he said finally, which was true but not complete. And because you and Daniel belong here. With my kibongi. Isabella studied his face with those careful brown eyes. Nathan, I know what we agreed, he said quickly. I know this was supposed to be about protection, not other things. But I need you to know, these past weeks watching you here, seeing you with Daniel. He stopped, unsure how to put his feelings into words without pressing her for something she might not be ready to give. What Nathan is trying to say, Mabel called from the doorway where she'd undoubtedly been listening, is that he's gone and fallen in love with his wife, which any fool could see from the way he looks at her. Nathan felt his face burn. Mabel. Don't you Mabel me, you stubborn fool. That girl deserves to know how you feel about her. Isabella looked between Nathan and the housekeeper, something like wonder dawning in her expression. Is that true? She asked softly. Nathan met her eyes directly. Yes, I know it's not what we planned, and I'm not asking you to feel the same way, but I needed you to know. Isabella was quiet for so long that Nathan's heart began to sink. Then she smiled, the first completely unguarded smile he'd seen from her, and his breath caught. "You impossible, wonderful man," she said, reaching for his hand. "Did you really think I hadn't noticed, that I hadn't felt the same thing growing between us?" Nathan's heart stuttered. "You what? I love you too, you stubborn rancher." Isabella's voice was warm with affection and exasperation. "I've been falling in love with you since the day you gave me your bedroom without a second thought. Since the first time you held Daniel and looked at him like he hung the moon." Nathan felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "Really? Really?" Isabella squeezed his hand. "I think it's time we stop pretending this is just a business arrangement, don't you?" Nathan laughed, the sound rough with emotion and relief. "Yes, yes, I think we should stop pretending." 6 months later, they renewed their vows in the church in town, this time with flowers and music and a celebration that lasted until dawn. Daniel was there in a christening gown Mabel had sewn by hand, gurgling happily through the ceremony that made his parents' love official in every possible way. The Morgans never did challenge the marriage in court. Victor died of a stroke that winter, and Edmund sold the family ranch and moved back east, apparently having lost his appetite for Montana winters and legal battles he couldn't win. Daniel grew up knowing the full story of his birth and his parents' meeting. Nathan and Isabella told him about Marcus, about the night in the storm, about the legal battle that had secured his future. But mostly they told him about love, how it could grow from the smallest acts of kindness, how it could overcome any obstacle when people chose to fight for it. Years later, when Daniel had children of his own, he would tell them the story of their grandmother Isabella, who had walked into a blizzard rather than surrender her child, and their grandfather Nathan, who had heard a cry for help in a storm and refused to ignore it. He would tell them that the strongest foundations weren't built on passion or convenience, but on the choice to keep choosing each other day after day through whatever storms might come. And in the parlor of the ranch house they'd built together, Isabella and Nathan would sit by the fire and smile, knowing that some love stories didn't begin with lightning strikes, but with the steady daily decision to be worthy of the gift they'd been given. The storm that had brought them together was long over, but the love it had created would last forever. Thank you for joining Isabella and Nathan on their incredible journey from strangers in a storm to partners for life. Their story reminds us that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin in the most ordinary moments of human kindness. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these tales of love and resilience reach across our beautiful country. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage, love, and the indomitable human spirit. Until next time, remember that every storm eventually passes, but the choices we make in those dark moments can light up the rest of our lives.